What Was That Like contains adult language and content and is not intended for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to What Was That Like? I'm your host, Scott Johnson. This is the show where we talk to regular people just like you or just like me, who have found themselves in an extremely unusual situation. We'll hear their stories and get inside their head because we all want to know, what was that like? More information about each episode at whatwasthatlike.com. Here we go. I've lived in areas where it gets really cold, and I've lived where it's warm most of the time. I've lived up north in Ohio and in Maine, and now I'm in sunny Florida. I definitely prefer the warmer climate. But today's story is about being cold, really, really cold. Dan Burton brought his fat tire bike to the coast of Antarctica, and he biked from there to the South Pole. That's 750 miles, and it's uphill, and it's against the wind, and it's in temperatures that are colder than just about anyone would be comfortable with. But he did it, and in fact, he was the first one to do it. And actually, it happened 5 years ago, and no one has done it again since then, at least not at the time we recorded this conversation, which is early 2019. And I learned something really interesting. The elevation at the South Pole is 9,300 feet, but only 300 feet of that is actual land. The 9,000 feet of elevation on top of that land is solid ice. So at the South Pole, Dan was standing on ice that was almost 2 miles thick. In fact, during our conversation, he mentions that he actually walked over some mountains, but he wasn't able to see them because he was actually on top of them because of that thick layer of ice. I'm always intrigued by stories of human endurance like this, so I really loved hearing this story firsthand from Dan. And fortunately for all of us, he also blogged and recorded video throughout the expedition, and he's written a book about it. So links to all of those things will be in the show notes for this episode at whatwasthatlike.com/19, because this is episode 19. And if you like this podcast, you're welcome to buy me a coffee. whatwasthatlike.com/coffee. And now, here's my conversation with Dan. What was the coldest temperature during this trip?
You know, I don't really know the answer to that because I didn't have a thermometer with me. Extra weight that I didn't need, I guess.
That's incredible. You're going to the South Pole and you don't know what the temperature is each day. That's interesting.
I looked at, because they do have a weather station there, and I kind of looked it up on the web, and I think that it was somewhere around 40 below when I was at the South Pole. And definitely when I was at the South Pole was the coldest of the trip. So it was somewhere around 40 below.
That just sounds miserable, actually.
You get used to it, and it's not as bad as it seems.
Well, and I kind of experienced that. We lived in Florida, and then my wife's from Maine, and we went and lived in Maine for 13 years. And you're right. I don't really care for the cold temperatures myself. I'd prefer Florida. My wife prefers the cold temps of up north. But you're right. The human body is pretty adaptable, and wherever you're at, you kind of get used to it.
Yeah, I had a guy that used to come into my bike store a lot. He kind of was a lot of what drove me to do this. Anyway, he was trying to tell me that the cold is kind of a state of mind. And I think there's obviously real things to cold, but I think there's a bit of that. If, I went there expecting it to be super cold and miserable. And when I got there, I just accepted that it was cold and it was okay.
Yeah, that's what you expected. So, all right. Well, what was the earliest germ of an idea that you had about doing this? What brought this on?
About doing this specifically would have been I had bought some fat bikes and had been riding them across Utah Lake when it was frozen, and about that time, Eric Larson started trying to bike to the South Pole. And one of the guys that I worked with at the bike shop told me about this. And so I started following him on his blog, reading his blog and following his expedition. And so that was kind of the beginning of the whole thing. I don't think, and then I had the guy that I was talking about earlier, he came into the bike store and kept saying that he was going to win the lottery. And when he did, that we were going to bike to the South Pole together. And there's no lottery in Utah, and neither of us ever enter the lottery, so that was never going to happen.
So much for that financing idea.
Yeah, so somewhere along that thing, it kind of got me going. My son was really strange, wanting to do all kinds. He had all these ideas of things he wanted to do Kickstarter projects for, and so at some point I thought, well, maybe I could Kickstarter this, and that's when I started really thinking about doing it myself. Was when I thought maybe I could pay for this with Kickstarter.
Did the Kickstarter work?
No.
Okay.
Kickstarter, you set your goal for how much money you need, and if you don't meet that goal, you get nothing. So I got nothing from Kickstarter.
I know the GoFundMe works differently. It's whatever you get up to, they send you a check for that. I think they're all a little different. Yeah,
I did a GoFundMe thing afterwards, and I don't know exactly how much money I got from GoFundMe. I guess I could go look it up on GoFundMe. It's still up there. But, I got some money from it, but not enough to be significant, statistically significant.
So when you first started thinking, maybe I really will do this, what was your physical condition at the time? How long did you give yourself for training?
I didn't train for it. I had been a computer programmer and had been in pretty bad shape, a little overweight, had high cholesterol, high blood pressure. And when I kind of got I panicked. I thought I was going to die, and I got into biking. And so after that, I started doing these crazy long mountain bike rides to start with, and then road bike rides. So I was doing like 200-mile road bike. It was officially a race, but I do that like once a year. And so, I could jump on my mountain bike and go do a 100-mile mountain bike ride, at any time. And so physically, condition wise, I was okay. The biggest thing for me was that a fat bike, the pedals are wider, further apart than normal to be able to fit around that big fat tire. And so it gives you just a different way that it's going to work the muscles and the joints and everything. And so just to make sure that I wasn't going to have a problem with that for the year before I did this, all I rode was my fat bike. I put away my mountain bike, put away my road bike, and didn't ride them for a year. Everything I did was on my fat bike. I did triathlons. I did everything on a fat bike.
So that was primarily how you trained then, just to make sure you were okay on that bike for extended periods of time.
Yeah. And so I was putting in lots of riding time, just what I do. And so I didn't do any specific thing that way. And the thing was, is I had a bike shop I was running, that I owned. And so I was at the bike shop, probably at least 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. And so it didn't leave me a lot of chance to do a lot of training. It would have been really cool to be able to take a fat bike and go out and ride it somewhere and kind of work out some of the things with pulling a sled and how that all could work. But I had no opportunity because when I decided to do it was late winter. And so, it was kind of the end of the snow bike season, and I didn't have the ability to go, up to Alaska or down, somewhere where I could actually test things out. So I just kind of had to go off of what I knew.
Yeah, you just train with what you can train, and or train as you can, and then just hope for the best, I guess.
Yeah, and to some extent, you're going to get out there and you're pushing hard every day, and as long as you can keep going, I guess basically the thing I had to physically to be able to do it is I had to be able to ride all day, doing a workout, a hard workout all day for, 13, 14 hours straight. And if I could do that, then I would be fine.
Right. But you think typically in training, you would do a hard workout like that and maybe do that 2 days, but then you take a rest day so your muscles can rebuild and then you do it again. But in your case, there's no rest days.
Yeah.
51 days straight, right?
Yeah. Well, so the first two Sundays, that's true. The rest of it, I took Sundays as a rest day.
Okay.
Not because I needed the rest as much as just for religious purposes.
I read all of your blog posts as you documented this trip, both before and during and after. I understand you had frostbite as a child. So going into extreme cold temperatures like this, did that scare you at all?
Well, yeah. So when I was a little kid, I was riding on my mom's shoulders, and the hood of my parka fell off, and so I was too young to, and whatever. So the hood of the parka fell off, and I got frostbite on my ears. And so for me, growing up, Halloween was like the most painful holiday because you'd go out trick or treating in that cold air, and I'd come in afterwards, and my ears would hurt so bad. And so, but as I got older and older, that became less of an issue. And so, yeah, frostbite was something I was concerned about. I was worried, I don't want to come back and be missing fingers and toes. And so I was very diligent in trying to make sure I protected myself from frostbite at all times.
Yeah, that's a big, definitely a critical factor. Now, before we get into the actual trip, there was one of your blog posts. I'm just going to actually read this blog post talking about the mental aspect of this trip. And what you wrote is this: one of my faults is that I don't know when to quit. When it comes to this expedition, I believe that fault becomes an advantage. However, my normal tendency to continue in spite of the conditions may not be enough. So I'm playing a bit of a mind game with myself. I'm intentionally building an attitude of continuing as long as even the remotest possibility of success still exists. Quitting can just not be an option. So I'm fostering in myself the belief that I will succeed. There will be some who will say the challenge is too hard, that for some reason I'm not worthy of such an expedition, and that's fine. They can believe what they want, but I must believe that I will complete the expedition. So how big of a factor was the mind game in reaching this goal?
I think that's probably one of the biggest factors. I think, Eric Larson had tried it the year before, and a lot of what I wrote there was in response to what I was trying to do. I mean, I had been trying to do that, and people were criticizing me for my attitude, saying I was arrogant. And it wasn't an arrogance, it was an intentional thing, because Eric looked like to me from the outside that he was doing well and he should be able to make it. But as I read his blog and stuff, I kept seeing this self-doubt in there. And whether I'm right or not, to me, that seemed like part of the reason why he didn't make it. And so for me, I'm looking at, okay, why did Eric not make it, and what things do I have to change so that I can? And so that was, to me, one of the things I was saying, okay, I cannot have this I can't let any attitude of failure enter into my planning and what I'm working on, because there's just it's too risky to have that in there. I had to have an attitude of success, or something this difficult. If you think you might fail, you probably will.
Well, I'm of the same way. We talked a little bit before we started recording here, and I've done some ultra marathons myself and long distance running. It's amazing to me that you can deliberately make your mind believe something just by saying it or by doing something. I've found that if I'm out several hours training and I just don't feel good, I've found that I can just deliberately smile. Even though I don't feel like smiling, just force yourself to smile. And for some reason, it just makes you feel better. It's like, well, okay, things maybe aren't so bad,
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of things. I don't know. There's a lot more mental aspect to something like this than what you might think.
Right. Yeah. It's just as important as the physical, I think. Okay. So let's talk about the trip itself. Can you describe the terrain? I understand you're starting at Hercules Inlet, which is by the coast, And the South Pole is more in the geographical center of Antarctica. And you are going from sea level to 9,300 feet. And can you just talk a little bit about that, or what you expected that to be like?
Yeah, and so Hercules Inlet, it's on the Ron ice shelf, and so it's technically on the ocean, but it's frozen. And so when they dropped me off at Hercules Inlet, I could look north, and just a frozen ocean as far as I could see. So it's technically the coast, but there wasn't any water anywhere nearby. And so I'm starting at sea level, and the first thing you got to do is climb up. And I know this from reading and reading other people's blogs and doing some research. The first thing you got to do is climb up from sea level up into the mountains, basically into the interior of Antarctica. So it's a pretty big climb to start with. And the thing that made it even more difficult is it was pretty soft snow. And so that first climb up was so difficult. I bet you I can't even imagine how difficult it was anymore because it's been too long. But it was more difficult than anybody could possibly imagine. And I knew that going in that it would be harder than I could possibly imagine. And it definitely was harder than even that. And so it was a pretty hard climb up in, and most of that I had to get off my bike and push. And a lot of times it was, I would be putting my chest against the handlebar and pushing with everything I could to push the bike up these hills. Because it's not only uphill in the snow and soft and everything, but there's a headwind the whole way. And so you're going.
Oh, what a bonus.
Yeah. You're going into this strong headwind, and it was killer. And I had to make sure I didn't have anything in my pockets in my coat up there on the chest, because I think I actually had like a GPS or something. One of my GPSs, I had several GPS units with me, and cracked the screen and everything because it was in there and pushing on it with my chest. So it was extremely difficult. Then you get up into the interior, and I figured, well, once I get in, there's actually a route that they use to drag fuel to halfway so that they can resupply or refuel airplanes. And so I can get up on that route that they're using to do that. And when I get onto that route, then it's going to be easier, and I'm going to be able to go okay. Well, I got up to where that was, and it's like, the snow was drifting through it, and it wasn't any better. And then the other thing you think, well, you're going from sea level to 9,300 feet. So that's 9,300 feet of climbing, basically, over 750 miles. You spread that out. That's not that steep of a climb. But the problem is it wasn't just, a slow, steady climb. It was up and down and up and down and up and down the whole time. And it was so frustrating. I got so mad at my GPS at times because it would say I was going downhill, and I was working so hard to go downhill. And it's like, there's no way this is going downhill. And there was one time I just chucked my GPS across the ice, saying this. I was so upset with it, but it was right. I mean, I was going up and down and up and down. And so it's kind of this constant up and down with several. There's a couple, at the beginning, there was a pretty big climb to get into the interior of Antarctica. And then there's a mountain range that goes through Antarctica. And there's a pretty big climb to get up over that mountain range, which I never saw the mountain range because it is completely buried in ice.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting factors here that I didn't realize until I was doing research for this, is that, the land itself is only about 300 feet above sea level.
At the South Pole, yeah.
Yeah, at the South Pole, right. But yet you're walking on ice, and not just ice, but 2 miles thickness of ice.
Yeah.
That's just incredible.
Yeah. The statistics, I might get this slightly wrong, but I think it's something like 90% of the fresh water in the world is in Antarctica, frozen in the ice.
So the bike that you describe, what you were carrying, or what your gear and your load was like. You had the bike, and then how did you carry all your stuff?
Yeah. So when Eric had tried it, he tried using panniers. So basically bags that are mounted on the front and back wheels, and he had all his stuff packed in there. And as I was reading his stuff, it sounded like, the wind resistance of that, because it makes a pretty big wind profile, sounded like that could have, that maybe if I put it down in a sled behind me, that they'd slip through the wind better. And so I had decided to take 2 sleds. And so I had 2 sleds that I was pulling from behind my bike. So I had rope tied I had a mount I created that hooked onto my rear axle, and then ropes from that back to one sled, and then from the one sled to the other. And I had some people questioning the idea of 2 sleds instead of you should be able to fit everything in one sled. The thing is I could put everything in one sled. I could put it in 2 sleds, and I actually had 2 panniers on my bike. So when I got there, I had a lot of flexibility in how to set things up. I could put a large percentage of my gear in the panniers, and then leave the 1 or 2 sleds pretty lightweight. Or I could take and put everything into one sled, or I could mix that up all I wanted. And what I found worked best was, and at the halfway where they refuel planes, I was able to say, I don't need panniers. So what I found best was to keep the bike absolutely as light as possible. So I threw away the panniers. I didn't throw them away. I sent them back on the plane at the halfway point, the panniers and the rack and all that, and just used the 2 sleds. So that's what worked best. And I could have put everything in one sled, but the sleds are sinking into the snow. And the more they can stay up on the snow and keep from breaking through that crust, the better they can glide. And so it's better to put it into 2 sleds and have it slide on top rather than in one sled and have it sink down in the snow further. And so, just going into it, I knew this was like on the job training, because nobody had ever done this. And what the best setup and the best way to do this was an unknown thing. And you could get some idea by trying to say, okay, what people doing that are doing the Iditarod on a bike or other things. But the conditions in Antarctica are unique to Antarctica, and the only way you're really going to know what works well in Antarctica is to try it in Antarctica.
So now you've given that information. Now whoever eventually does this and maybe breaks your record will have that information as an advantage to start with. I'm sure they appreciate that.
That'd be cool. There's one record they can't break. I'm the first, and you can't break that.
That's right.
You can do it faster and better and all that, and I hope somebody does. So far, nobody has, but I hope someday somebody comes out and does it. Does it better than what I did.
It's inevitable, I think. So, starting right off the bat, this on day 1, December the 2nd, 2013. About an hour, you were about an hour in, and you'd gone less than a mile, and you thought you forgot your camera.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
It was kind of, I guess I'm bad at forgetting things. I just do that kind of stuff. And so as I started, I'm going, and it's like, oh man, because when I got dropped off, we did some filming and stuff when the plane dropped me off, and got some film of the plane taken off and stuff like that. And then I, packed everything in my bags and headed out. And then I thought, oh man, did I really get my camera packed in there? And so, it's kind of like that thing. Did I really remember to close the garage door? And so I was like, oh man, I had to check this now. So I had to stop and set up my tent and get in. And then once I started going through my gear, it's like my camera was there, which was nice, but it also made a good to get me off. You don't want to stay at the place you get dropped off that first night anyway. There's no night, but anyway, that first night, and you don't want to stay there. So it's good to get in. I was hoping I had all kinds of visions of grandeur. I don't know what you'd call it. I always thought I was going to do so well. So when I got dropped off, I look up and I see the mountains out in the distance, and I'm thinking, first day I'm going to get up and over and out to those mountains. Yeah. A week later, I'm still working at it.
Well, you're right. You got to stay positive. Think the best, right?
Yeah.
Were there any other surprises in those first few days, or it was just slogging forward as expected?
I already said it. It was so difficult. It was just so hard, and I knew it was. I did. I had I guess the thing that was kind of weird to me is there was a guy who was trying to set the record for being able to ski from where I got dropped off to the South Pole in the shortest amount of time. And he's one of the problems in Antarctica is the earlier in the season you start, the softer the snow is going to be. And so he started maybe, when he started, the snow was too soft and the conditions were bad and stuff. And so he wasn't getting the distance that he wanted to get, the speed he was needing to get to break the record. So he turned around and came down, and we crossed, going opposite directions. And looking at, as he goes back and just how hard and how bad it was for me going up this thing, I'm thinking, what kind of idiot would ever do this twice? And so it was amazing to me that he would turn around, go back to the bottom and try it again, because, and maybe a lot of that was because pushing a bike up the hill and all that went into that was more difficult than skiing up the hill. But it wasn't surprising, but I guess the thing that was surprising to me was that he would turn around and go back and do it again. But the other thing that was interesting about that is shortly, probably less than an hour after he passed going the other direction, and I'm following his ski trail, which makes a nice, easy navigation thing for me. I don't have to worry about what direction I'm going, just follow his ski tracks. And as I'm doing that, I step down and my leg falls into a crevasse. And it was on the same path that he had skied. I mean, I got a picture of it, and you can see his ski tracks going right next to the hole that I fell in. And so that was one of the things that was known up front, that this was an extra level of danger in this, because I know I'm going to have to get off the bike and push at points. And the places I'm going to have to push are probably the places that are going to be the most dangerous as far as crevasses are concerned, because the crevasses are going to be in those places where you're coming over an edge and stuff where the ice is moving more. And so it's the most dangerous place to be on foot was where I was most likely going to have to push, and it was where I was pushing. And so I fell in. I don't know how big the crevasse was. I don't know if it was big enough to actually fall completely in. One leg fell in, and I was able to pull myself up using my bike, and I could see some nice hard blue ice forward. And so I quickly got up on that and didn't dare go back and get a picture, because it was, I didn't want to be there for the rest of my life.
No way.
Which wouldn't have been too long.
Right. Well, in talking about a crevasse, that's a word that's kind of specific to this type of an expedition. When the ice moves and separates and creates these big gaping holes, sometimes which are visible and other times they're not that visible, the danger was to just fall in and who knows how far you would fall, and then you're just there. Nobody could come and get you, right?
Well, yeah. And so there's a video out there. I think it's mostly an ad for Iridium, but there's a lady who had gone a few years before I did, and she had done some bad things as far as the way she planned her route and mixed two routes together. Anyway, so it sent her across these crevasses that were known to be there, and so she goes across that, and she fell in. I dropped in far enough that she had to work her way up and be able to poke a hole in the crevasse above where she could get back up to, poke a hole with her ski pole, and then get a satellite signal out through that. And they actually did get in and rescue her. and then she continued on and completed her trip to the South Pole. So yeah, it's possible to get rescued if you can get a good signal out to a satellite, and if it's not a whiteout, so they can actually come and get you. But yeah, and so it's funny because there's a few things about this expedition. If I go back and watch and stuff, they'll just bring me to tears. And watching that video from her, it's very emotional for me. Even though it's probably not that big of a deal, but for me it really hits. And just that whole idea of being in a crevasse and dying there is not a good idea.
Right. I watched that video. I think you have it linked or embedded on one of your blog posts. I watched that video, and boy, what a great ad for that for Iridium.
Yeah.
The cell phone, or satellite. It's a satellite phone, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, she was amazed. She was down in this crevasse, not able to get out on her own. And she gets her phone out and she's got like 5 bars, a perfectly strong signal. So she's able to talk to someone. That's got to be the biggest relief in the world. And I'll have a link to that video on the show notes for this episode as well. So people can watch that.
Yeah. That's an amazing video to me. And so, but that also brings to a point that I have things in place that in an emergency situation, there is a backup and a plan to be able to get me out of there. But on that, they can fly in and rescue you and stuff, but they can't do that if it's a whiteout condition. And so the weather conditions in Antarctica are extreme difficult. And there were days, I know there was at least a 3-day period, probably even longer than that, periods of time at which if something happened, they couldn't have gotten to me for 3 or 4 days because the weather would not have permitted it. And so there's a certain amount of danger and I have to be able to survive on my own for however long it's going to take for them to be able to get there.
That just in itself, that's got to be a little scary,
You'd think it should be, but for some reason, I don't know. I don't think I was as scared as maybe I should have been.
Now, when you're talking about them, you're referring to the company ALE. What does that stand for?
Antarctic Logistics and Expeditions.
And they were really their cost was the primary or the majority of the cost of this trip, right? Because you didn't bring all of your supplies. They met you how many times throughout the trip, or they dropped things, right?
Yeah, they didn't meet me as much as they I always say fly in, but sometimes it wasn't actually flying to get there because like when they're dragging the fuel out to the fuel stop, they can bring it there and drop it off along the way. But basically what they would do is they would fly into some place along my route, dig a hole in the ice, bury my stuff in the ice, put a black flag on it, give me the GPS coordinates of where they put it, and then tell me to go play geocaching for life.
Yeah, geocaching for your very survival.
Yeah. And so I had 3 resupplies that we did that way, but so ALE, you look at it, and so I can't. I think I'm not supposed to say exactly how much it was because I think that's in my contract with them, but I can't remember exactly off the top of my head how much it was. But it's somewhere in that $60,000 to $70,000 that I'm paying them. And if you look at what they're doing, they're flying me from Chile down to Union Glacier. They have a camp that they put up there with tents and a whole thing that they're running there to support everything, and a communications tent and everything that goes into that. And it's like amazing what an awesome camp they put there at the Union Glacier. And then they're doing my food supplies. I'm calling into them every day on a satellite phone, giving them updates, and they're keeping track of me. And if something happens, then they can come and get me. And so you look at everything that they're putting and flying me back to Union Glacier after I'm done, and then flying me back to Chile. And you put it all together and say, how much would it cost to just do that if they were just doing that for me alone? And there's no way they could do that for what they're doing. And the only way that it's as cheap as it is, which I know that doesn't sound cheap, but the only way that it's as cheap as it is because they've also got people going and doing things like climbing Mount Visson, or going to see penguins, or people that just want to fly to the South Pole. And so there's all these other things that are going on that I think reduce the cost, that make it so that an expedition like mine is even possible.
You still got to do all the hard work, but they've got all the experience to tell you, this is how you plan it, and this is the way it'll work. So that's what an amazing service. Yeah. While you were out there, did you listen to music or podcasts, or how did you occupy your mind all that time?
Yeah. So when I started, I started just silent. I had an iPod with some music on it, but I started not listening to it. And so I spent, I don't know, maybe a week or 2 before I started listening to music. And it was really an amazing thing. You get out there and there's just nothing making any noise at all. Even the wind, unless it's hitting me or my equipment, is making no noise because it's not hitting anything else. And so it's this silence that I've never experienced anywhere else, just this complete silence. And to be able to experience that was amazing. But then later on, I started using the music, and music really helped me a lot. And there's a lot of songs that have well, maybe not a lot, but there's certain set of songs that have a special meaning to me because of how I interacted with them during my expedition. So I've got a set of songs that just have a special meaning to me because of that.
In thinking about this and then just watching the videos of you as you recorded kind of your video journal throughout this trip, which I recommend everybody watch. It's just awesome to see what it was like out there and how you described what you did that day and that kind of thing. But, I can't help but draw the comparison with this trip and the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks, with him being by himself and he had that toothache. He had to knock out his own tooth. That's just I just cringe when I think about that. But did you, while you were out there all alone, did you have any kind of medical emergencies at all?
I just about killed myself, I guess. In the tent, you can never really get upright. And so at best, and most of the time I was sitting there eating while kind of laying on my stomach. And I'm doing that. And I got the hiccups, which happens, and I continued to eat anyway. And while I was eating, I hiccup and got some food stuck in my throat. And every time I'd try to cough it out, I'd just about get it out, and I'd get hiccup again, and it would relodge into my throat, and it just kept going on, and there's like nobody to help me, and that was probably my biggest major medical. Just about died from the hiccups because there's nobody there to help and whatever, and I was going to choke to death, and that would be a pretty dumb thing. One of the things with ALE is I call into them every day, and if I failed to call into them, then they would send somebody out to find me and see what the deal was, and so I would be pretty embarrassing to say, okay, well, look, there he is, he choked to death.
It's a little late for the Heimlich maneuver at that point.
Yeah.
Did you use solar power to power your electronics and stuff?
Yeah, I had some Goal Zero solar panels I had bought, and I was charging. I did have the problem is lithium ion batteries don't work well in super cold temperatures. Sometimes I had a hard time charging things, and it actually, if you I don't know, maybe you can get it from my blog or not, because the posts eventually ended up. But there was a time period after my main battery I was using, I had a little Wi-Fi adapter that let me connect from my phone, well, not phone, iPod, and to the Wi-Fi adapter, and then to my satellite phone. And that battery for that adapter eventually ran out, and I couldn't get it to recharge. And it couldn't recharge just because it's so cold. It's hard to charge things.
And that's just one of those things that you don't know until you're out there and it happens.
Yeah, well, a lot of times you can get things to charge and stuff, but that battery there were a couple batteries I just couldn't charge. It was kind of funny because I don't know, funny, but when I went a couple days with no blog posts showing up on my blog, people started calling my wife and saying, "Is he alive? Is he okay?" and stuff. And so it eventually I just started. I'd write down my blog entry and then read it off to my wife, who would put the phone on record and go play games with people and ignore me while I was. and then she'd transcribe that and put it up onto the blog for me.
You had many types of support systems on this trip, sounds like.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because just recently there was Colin O'Brady, who did an expedition from coast to coast, and being the first to do that unsupported and whatever, basically saying unsupported. And there were people complaining, well, you were getting advice about what to eat and whatever, and so that's not really unsupported. And the reality is you can't do something like this completely unsupported. And so their definition of unsupported is you don't have somebody physically being there helping you.
How many hours of sleep did you usually get?
Not enough. I think I fall asleep really easily. I don't have any trouble sleeping normally. But anybody that's done a lot of, if you do a lot of training and stuff, you get in that overtrained mode. One of the symptoms of being overtrained is inability to sleep, and I've done that outside of this, but I was definitely suffering from that there, where I'm typically going 13 or more hours a day, and at an extreme. I mean, at an effort that I shouldn't. I mean, if I'm trying to say, okay, I'm going to do something at an effort that is sustainable so I can go for 13 hours, that amount of effort to make it sustainable was much less than what I had to do. And so it just was what should have been an unsustainable effort all day for 13 hours. And you're just so beat up from that it takes a long time to get to sleep. And so I'm doing that and setting up the tent and eating and making my blog entries and calling into ALE and all that stuff. And so I was getting, I don't know, I didn't keep track of how many hours I was getting asleep, but it just wasn't enough. And especially with that much work, you probably needed more than a normal 8 hours of sleep. And I was getting, less than that. And I just was having a hard time sleeping. And I didn't think the 24 hours of daylight was going to be a problem for me, but it was. And then the other problem was, one of the ways to get around that is you take your sleeping bag and pull that up over your head, and it's dark, and then you're okay. But my sleeping bag, it was a nice new sleeping bag that I'd gotten, and it turns out I was allergic to the sleeping bag.
Oh man!
And so I could only pull the sleeping bag up to my chest, and I couldn't pull it up over my head. Otherwise, I woke up in the morning all puffy and hardly able to see. And so I pull that over up to my chest, and then I had my parka, and I throw that parka over my head, my body to kind of help. But you wake up, and I wake up typically several times during the night, and you wake up and it's light, and so you think it's time to get up, but it's nope, it's only 11 o'clock. Oh, nope, it's only 12 o'clock. Nope, it's only 12:30. All night long. Waking up, it's like, time to get going yet? Oh, nope, got to go back to sleep. So
right, and just because of where you were on the planet, the sun, it never went away. It was light all the time.
Yeah, the sun's just goes in a big circle around the horizon. I think it's about 23 degrees above the horizon, and the reason I say 23 degrees is because there's this really cool effect when the ice, if you get any moisture in the air, it turns to ice, and those ice crystals will float kind of sideways, and then the sun hits that, and it makes this really cool optical effect of a couple rainbows and a halo, and it's just an amazing sight. And that the bottom of that first circle is the first circle is about 23 degrees out from the sun, and the bottom of that circle just hit the horizon. And so at morning hours, the sun was about 23 degrees, and where I started, it would probably get a few degrees higher when it's south or north of me, and a few degrees lower when it's south of me. But then when you get to the South Pole, it's just at the same elevation around the horizon the whole time.
Did you lose any weight during this trip?
Yeah. So
I can imagine.
So one of the things that ALE asked as I was getting ready was how much weight I had put on in preparation.
Oh, so that's part of the preparation, is to gain weight ahead of time?
That was one of the things, and I tried. But I was biking to and from work on my fat bike and I just couldn't put on weight beforehand. I was eating as much as I could, and so I went in. I was in pretty good shape and not quite as much fat as I would have liked. When I got to the South Pole, I had absolutely zero fat left, and my body was basically consuming itself. I was burning off muscle mass. When I got back, you're not going to get undressed in Antarctica because, it's kind of cold there and you can't take a shower or anything. So, 51 days of that. When I finally got back to the base camp at Union Glacier, and they have a shower there, and I get out and try to take a shower, and it's like I looked like something, one of those really terrible anorexic pictures you see, or a starving child, and it was just I couldn't believe how bad I looked. I lost too much weight.
And there was one story that I read on the blog. Can you talk about when somebody gave you a bottle of Coke?
Yeah. so I actually, at the halfway point, I had the ability to leave behind things that I didn't need because a plane could then fly it back. And at that point, I had extra food that I hadn't, and I had, it wasn't really extra food because it was food I needed to eat. But the reality is there's only so much you can eat. You know, your body can only digest a certain amount of calories. And so even though I needed more calories, there's only so much I could eat and digest. And so
which is why you lost all that weight.
Right. And so it's just impossible to get enough calories in to what I was burning. And so I had extra food at that point, what I thought was extra food. And so I sent it back on the plane. And I calculated out how much I would need to make it to the South Pole. And then I got a resupply. And when I got that resupply, again, I had more food than what I thought I needed. And so I was, you make up a batch of food and you eat some of it and the rest of it goes in a hole in the ice. And so I was wasting food. And I was doing that because it was extra weight and stuff. And I calculated out, and this is how long it's going to take me, and I don't need that. Well, it was kind of a dumb thing to do. I did several dumb things, but that was one of the dumb things I did, was wasted that food. And so at the end, things didn't work out, the whiteouts and the snow got soft, and I was just so exhausted. I just wasn't getting the distance I needed. And so I could have stretched out my food and made it to the South Pole, but I was surviving on, at that point, a couple small meals a day. In fact, one day, my meal one evening for dinner, I took took all the empty packages from the food I'd eaten before and found the little pieces of frozen stuff in the corners and of the package and ate that, and that was my dinner.
Because you're carrying, obviously, you eat food out of a package, and you keep the package because you don't just leave it on the ground. You're carrying it all with you.
Everything you take with you has to come back out. You see somebody surviving on the streets and eating out of the garbage. It's not quite the same thing, but I know what it's like to scavenge through my garbage to find something to eat. And so it turned out I had like a couple meals left, and it's like I could have eaten one, gone. I was in a state of, I was trying to eat a meal and get like 12 miles out of that meal, and then eat the next meal and get 12 miles out of it. But the problem is there wasn't enough calories in one meal to get a full 12 miles. I would completely be exhausted and out of energy and basically collapse on the ice because I just was out of energy. So because there wasn't enough meal in there. And the thing was I was close to the end. And so I said, okay, I'm going to eat my last two meals instead of spacing them out. And then I talked to ALE and said, okay, I'm completely out of food. And they said, okay, we'll send Hannah down on a snowmobile. She'll come down and give you some more food.
And so how far out were you at that point?
About 20 miles.
Okay.
And so she came down with some food. And one of the things that she gave me was a bottle of Coke. And it was frozen solid bottle of Coke. And it's like, oh man, I mean, the bottle of Coke never looked so awesome. And I took that bottle of Coke and I set up my tent and went through the food that she gave me. I ate a bunch of chocolate bars. And I think the first chocolate bar I had was one that had like coffee in it. And I don't do coffee. And I think coffee tastes terrible. And it's also a religious reason I don't do coffee. And I take a bite of that and it's the coffee and it's like, I don't care. And I just shove the whole thing down my throat. It was so...
Forgive me, God.
Yeah, it's like I'm not wasting that. And so I ate that, and while I'm doing that, I set up my pot and get some water boiling, and I put the bottle of Coke in that, and got the water boiling, and melted the Coke, got the Coke all nice and warm. And then when I started going, I didn't wear my parka while I was riding because I'm working so hard. The parka would have been way too hot. I would have gotten sweaty, and that's very dangerous. And so I would dress down while I'm biking because I was working so hard. So I take my parka and I bury that Coke in there and pack it down deep into my sled so it'll stay nice and warm. And I figure, I'll do that. And then at the end of because it's like 20 miles left to go. So after I've gone, 15 whatever miles and I need that extra boost, I'll pull that Coke out and I'll drink it. And I get to where I decide, okay, now's the time. I pull the Coke out and it's still warm. And so it's like, oh, cool. And I open up the Coke, and as I'm opening it up, it starts to freeze. And I open it up and it's freezing, and I'm drinking this Coke as fast as I can to try to keep it from freezing. And that whole brain freeze idea. And so I'm drinking, and the problem is I had gone 2 months with no carbonation. And so that carbonation was just burning my throat as it goes down. It was the hardest Coke, but I was drinking as fast as I could because I wanted to get as much of it out as I could. And I got about half of it out before I couldn't get any more out. And so, yeah, it was that's my story. When people ask how cold it is, that's how cold it was.
The Coke freezes before you can even drink half of it.
Yeah.
All right. So the last day, this was January 21 of 2014. Describe reaching the goal, or when you got to be within sight of the South Pole.
Yeah. So as I'm going up and down. I'm watching my GPS and the GPS, because I know that South Pole's at 9,300 feet, and I've also read some blogs and stuff, so I know that you can see the South Pole. What for a lot of people is about a day's travel out from the South Pole, because 13 to 15 miles a day is actually a pretty good day. And so it's about, and I knew about that far away, I'd be able to see the South Pole. And so because there's a research base there. And so you can see the research base, and they have a big telescope and some stuff out there that they're doing research with. And so I knew you'd be able to see that. And so I'm watching my GPS and I'm watching the elevation go from, 87 or something and up and then back down, and then just getting so frustrated because it keeps saying I'm going back and it's like I need just want to get up to 9,300 feet. And when I finally did, I got up to 9,300 feet and I looked off in the distance and I could see what I wasn't sure at first if it was this South Pole Station or if it was just sastrugi. And sastrugi are kind of like snowdrifts that form down there. They're really amazing. And I'm looking off and I see these, and it's like the problem is at that far south, the sastrugi are just kind of non-existent. And so and so it's like, well, it could be or not. And then after a little while, it's like, nope, that's it. And so when I realized that's really it, I could see the South Pole. It was the most wonderful thing I had ever seen, and it was just like these 3 dots on the horizon. And so I'm just like bawling. This is so awesome. I can see it. I can see it. I can see the South Pole. And so I pull out my satellite phone and I call my wife, and I can see it. I can see it. And she can understand what I'm saying through the tears. The tears of joy were very much there. I'm just overwhelmed and stuff. And this is so awesome. And she's like, what? And the phone line drops, because that's how most of my phone conversations ended, is with the line dropping on me. And so the phone line drops out on her, and I continue on. But then for the next little way, because so the thing is when you're going to the South Pole, and they've got the research there, and they've got antennas buried in the ice, and they have this thing where they're studying neutrinos and all these different, this clean section and this place where they're studying CO2 and all this stuff. So you can't go into different regions, because if you do, you're going to mess up the studies. And so there's a very specific route you have to take to get into the South Pole. And what that means is basically I've got to kind of go not straight towards the pole. I got to go off to the side a little bit and then turn in, which basically meant that means as I'm going, the South Pole Station is visible off to my right. And I had to kind of crane my head to the left a little bit and not look to the right, because if I ever saw that thing, it was just so overwhelming. I just break down in tears again. And then eventually you drop back down into this big bowl, and everything the South Pole disappears and everything. You can't see it anymore. And you got this big drop. You got to go down and then regain all that altitude again and stuff. But yeah, so it was just this amazing thing. It's impossible to describe the joy of how awesome it was to see that and know I'm done. I wasn't done. It was still, 13 miles away. And so it's still a long, probably about 13 hours worth of travel, because at this point, I was back to having to push my bike most of the way, because the snow conditions there were just we just couldn't bike. That last day and a half ish was not very bikeable. So I'm pushing and just kind of taking and stopping and looking around and just kind of realizing that I'm here. I'll never be here again. And even if you could come back to the exact same spot, you wouldn't be in the same thing. The finishing the first bike expedition to the South Pole. It's something that I need to enjoy. So even though I wanted to go home and be done with this more than you can possibly imagine, I was just like, okay, I'm done. I can take the time and look around and see and try to figure out things, try to enjoy that last few days, that last few hours, that last day. And then when I finally got to the South Pole, into the area there, they have a section set aside for where it's the NGO, the non-government camping. So people that aren't part of the government can go and camp there and whatever. And usually what they have is the ALE, they set up a camp there and they have tents and a nice warm place to go in and some food to greet you with, cookies and chocolate and awesome. And you get to talk to people and joy in being done and everything. But the problem is they run that camp until January 20th. And I got there on January 21st.
And they closed on the 20th.
Yeah. In fact, when Hannah brought that stuff down, it was basically, here's some stuff that you can have as we're leaving. And so they flew off. There was nothing there. You could see, a couple indents in the snow where their tents and stuff would have been. And there wasn't anything there. So I was there all by myself. And when I got there, I don't even know what time of day it was, but I remember calculating it out that for the people at the South Pole Station, they're running on New Zealand time frame. And so for them, it was like early morning. So, they would all be asleep and whatever. And so there's no sign of anybody else there. Big building, that's got people in it, but they're all asleep. And so I go out there and they've got this ring of flags around a pole in the ground that's like a barber pole type thing with a mirror ball on top. And that's not really the South Pole. That's just kind of a thing they've got set up so you can go there and take pictures and it's kind of a really nice photo op South Pole.
The touristy South Pole.
Right? Yeah. Well, and it just makes good pictures and stuff like that. But the real South Pole was a little bit beyond that. And so I go to where the real South Pole is, and it's the stick in the ground. They've got a stick in the ground or in the ice, a stick in the ice marking it with a little emblem on the top. And it probably, I don't know, to me that was kind of a very anticlimactic, because it's like, this big, awesome, I see it, I'm there, and I'm so overwhelmed with joy when I first saw it. And then when I finally got there, it's like, okay, I'm here. Now what? There's nobody around, nothing to do. What? And so I go back to my tent and set up my tent. And they had another supply of my stuff that I had. This is the stuff I want at the South Pole, like a nicer camera and some things that I had. And so they had that cached somewhere. And I got my tent set up and everything. And at that point I was usually pretty drenched in sweat from my things, which is not a good thing, but it's kind of just the condition of what would happen. So I was kind of wettish and stuff, and you get that off, and it's so bitter cold there. And so I get the tent set up and everything, and I know my stuff is out there, but it's like, it's just too cold. I'm not going out to find it. And so then the next day, after I dried out and everything, and it's still just as bitter cold. But at that point, it wasn't so bad, and I could go out and find my cache and stuff. And then there was a guy that was skiing to the South Pole, and he showed up that next day. And for him, he was in that same state as I was the day before, where it's just so cold because you're still moist from the workout and everything, and not wanting to get out. Whereas for me at that point, it's like, yeah, it's still bitter cold, but it's bearable because I'm not wet anymore.
What an awesome thing to get to the finish line. That's just amazing. The next day, and the people inside the buildings woke up and everything. Is that were they surprised to see you there already, or when did they expect you to be there?
Yeah, they would have known. There's expeditions going in from the South Pole or from the coast into the South Pole, there were probably like, maybe 4 or 5, 6 expeditions that were doing that year. And so there were other people doing it, and the scientists there, they know what's going on, and they're kind of keeping track of what's going on. And not only that, before I enter into the protected areas, into that path to go in, I had to make a satellite phone call, and I call ALE and say, okay, I'm here, I'm entering. And so, and they notify the scientists there. So they all know that I'm there. And so not a surprise to them, but then they come out and they, ALE scheduled a tour for us. So Vesa and I got to go in and tour the station, which is pretty cool to go and see all that stuff. And one of the most miserable things I've ever done, because I was so used to the cold, and 40 degrees felt more comfortable to me than that 70 degrees or however warm it was in there. It was so sickening. I don't know what it's like to be drunk, but I imagine that's what it was like to be drunk. I just felt so sick to my stomach, and I couldn't stand up straight, and it just was this awful feeling because it was just way too warm and uncomfortable to be in a place that was a reasonable temperature, because I wasn't. I was just too used to the cold at that point. I couldn't wait to get out of that place, because it was, you'd think, oh yeah, nice, you can get in out of the cold. It's like, no, I couldn't wait to get back out into the cold, because that was just so miserable and so awful.
How did the expedition and the notoriety that came with it, how did that affect your bike business?
I closed my bike shop. I don't think it really helped my bike shop much. I mean, I did get some publicity out of it, but my problem with the bike shop was mostly that I'm not good at being a businessman. I'm too much of a pushover, I guess, and so I gave away too much stuff. And I know that it's bad, and that you can help more people if you stay profitable, but I did things that I was like, well, this isn't the best business thing, but I'm helping somebody, and so I don't care. That's what I'm going to do. And so, I was losing money year after year after year on the bike shop, and it wasn't sustainable. And so, but also at that time, the bike shop was a lot of work, and I had put a lot into it and stuff. And there's a certain point at which it's like, okay, I'm ready to move off of that and do something else. And so it, I thought maybe it could help with marketing on the bike shop. It didn't help as much as I had wanted it to, and I ended up closing the bike shop.
You have had, since this happened, and this was 5 years ago now, you still have some numbness in your feet. Is that right? Or has that gone away?
Yeah, no, my feet are still having a numbness. It's kind of hard to describe. When I first got back, it was kind of like when you go to the dentist and your face is all numb and it feels all fat and puffy. My hands were like that. My feet were like that when I first got back. The hands, I think, are all okay. I mean, I have a lot of nerve damage in my hands from pocket knives and things like that anyway, as a kid, getting cut and different things like that. So my fingertips are not the greatest. But when I first got back, like I was a computer programmer before I opened the bike shop. When I first got back, I had a really hard time doing anything with the computer, because my fingers, the numbness, it was hard to type, and the numbness and lack of circulation, I guess, in the fingertips, they didn't work very well on touch screens when I first got back too. And then my feet were basically numb. I got back, and it's winter, and I could go out and take the garbage out to the street and stuff barefoot, and it wouldn't bother me at all, because my feet were just completely numb. They've come back to where they're not that numb anymore, but as if when I walk around barefoot, it's still a weird numbness that I have in them, and they just feel a little weird. And most of the time I get used to it and I forget about it. But when I walk around barefoot, it frequently reminds me, oh yeah, your feet are still numb.
Oh yeah, that South Pole thing. That's
yeah. And so I don't know if they'll ever fully come back. I actually kind of I did some cold damage to them on a scouting Klondike Derby camp out, where I got my feet too wet and cold one night, and so my feet had poor circulation going into it, And then when you're biking, sitting on a seat, I think cuts off some blood flow. And then also pedaling, if you pedal a long time, your feet tend to go numb. And so pedaling that long every day for 51 days, and then add into the cold, I think all that just did enough damage. And so my feet don't do well with the cold. I like going out and biking with the fat bike in the snow, but I don't do it much anymore because if I get out in the cold, my feet get cold really quick, and they turn all black and purple and stuff. And so my feet don't handle the cold very well anymore. And that's part of why I'm trying to move to Florida.
You put your body through so much trauma for that 51 days and the extreme temperatures. I guess it's understandable that there would be some kind of lasting effects.
Yeah, and so I figure I've had enough winter for a lifetime, although it was summer while I was down there. But I've had enough winter for a lifetime, so it's time for me to find some good tropical things to do. So I'm staying in Florida right now, but I have a house in Utah, and I need to get somebody to buy my house in Utah so that then I can buy something smaller and more affordable here in Florida.
One extreme to the other, I guess.
Well, yeah, what I really want to do is I want to get a sailboat, and my vision for that is to be able to go and sell that to different places where there are places where I can do some helping people with like hurricane relief, or just with different levels of things you can do for humanitarian service, and be able to sell to some place and do some humanitarian service project, and then sell to another place and do that over and over. And that's my fantasy, my vision, what I want to do. We'll see what I actually am able to accomplish. My wife doesn't want to live on a sailboat.
That sounds like a pretty good retirement plan to me.
Yeah, and I can do it if I sell my house and buy a sailboat that would be much cheaper, or buy a smaller house. I don't have to go back to work anymore. But with the house I have right now, I can't afford to be retired and keep the house I have.
Looking back on it now, is there anything that you would have done differently?
Yeah, I wouldn't have dropped off so much food at the halfway point and wasted that food.
I don't know. But you needed that at the end.
Yeah, I did. And so it's hard to, I mean, yeah, there's obviously a lot of things I learned and could improve on. I think hopefully somebody else can improve it. I wouldn't bother bringing the panniers to start with. So there's some different ways I would set up my sled. I talked to some guy. There was a guy that wanted to do what I did, and I was talking to him. And I was saying, well, the easier way to do it would be to start at the South Pole and go to the coast. Now, nobody really cares. It's like if you want something and people are going to like, ooh, cool, you're the first person to bike to the South Pole. They're not going to care if you bike from the South Pole to the coast, but if you bike from the coast to the South Pole, they're going to care about that. And so, I mean, that's the real expedition, is to go from the coast to the South Pole. But if you want to do it easier, you start at the pole and you go to the coast, because then you're downhill with the tailwind. And then the other thing is like if you could get more float, so wider tires. And so he built up a custom bike that was like 2 tires wide. My tires were like 5 inches wide, and he took 2 of those and stuck them side by side, and so make essentially a 10-inch wide bike and stuff. And he tried to do that going the opposite direction, but it didn't work out too well for him. He ended up being picked up and flown out, and sent me a message saying, his wife sent me a message saying how impressed he was with what I had done, because she said he was a super tough guy, and it really just the difficulty of it anyway. So I'm not trying to say I'm better than him and he was worse or whatever, anything like that, because the conditions, everybody's got different things, and maybe the setup for the bike just wasn't the right setup and whatever. But yeah, there's some things I would definitely try to see if I could get a little bit wider tires so you can get a little bit more float. There's a lady who's planning on going to it. She was planning on doing it the same year I did, but she's still working on trying to get the funding to be able to bike to the South Pole. and she's got a 2-wheel drive bike that she's going to try to use. And it's interesting, and I've always said I don't think that's a good idea. I think there's way too many mechanical issues and weight and stuff. I think it's not the right choice, but I could be wrong, because it could be that having propulsion at the front and back would make it so you could bike things that were very difficult for me. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if she actually does it. I think it's the wrong choice, but Eric thought that the sleds was the wrong choice, and I think he was wrong. And so, just because I think it's wrong, and I think it wouldn't, I think the 2-wheel drive is a bad idea, doesn't necessarily mean it is.
Yep, she might find differently.
Yeah, and it'll be cool to see somebody. Nobody else has really done that. There's been a couple other little bit of biking expeditions out there, but nobody's actually tried to go from the coast to the South Pole by bike since I did it. And that was 5 years ago. Maybe they look at what I went through and said, oh, that was stupid. I'm not going to do that.
There's the purpose that your video blog serves, that you can scare other people away from even trying it when they see what you were going through.
Well, yeah. And I also think, I may be wrong, but I think if I told ALE I want to do this now, and they would look at, okay, what have you done? I think they probably would tell me, no, they're not going to let me do it until I get some more polar experience and some crevasse training. And I think in part that's my fault, because when I did it, I opened up a crevasse, and I think somebody else pushing a bike may have opened up a crevasse too. I'm not positive on that. And so I think they're a little bit spooked about that, because there are definitely crevasse dangers that are worse for being on a bike than skiing, because you do have to get off and push at points and that extra risk. And so I know there's another guy I've talked to that's trying to do an expedition from coast to coast on a bike. And I know that they said, and he's got some pretty good experience in that. And they told him, no, you can't do this until you go off and get some crevasse training. So I think maybe they're being a little more careful about that because of problems that I did. But the reality is the thing that usually stops people from doing this is just the sheer cost of it.
Yeah, I can imagine. Dan, this is an awesome story. I love hearing stories like this. And I'm going to have, I know you are all over the web. You've got your YouTube channel, you on Facebook, you've got a Wikipedia page, and of course your blog that documented everything throughout, as well as video documentation throughout the trip. I'm going to have all of that linked on the show notes for this episode, so people can go and watch that and get even a better idea of what you were going through. I think it's pretty awesome, and I appreciate you sharing your story with us.
Well, thank you. It's always fun to share it. I guess in some ways I feel like that's kind of one of the obligations that you have after doing something is you have to write a book. And you have to share it with everybody that you can. So yeah, I've got a book. I've got my videos that I put together that go through the whole expedition, and then my blog that is out there. And yeah,
excellent. So we'll get all that out there, and good luck, and have a great retirement in Florida.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode. My goal for each show is to introduce you to people and stories that you just won't find on other podcasts. If you want to help support the show, you just need to subscribe, and that way you'll never miss an episode. You can click on any of the subscribe buttons on the website, which is whatwasthatlike.com. You'll see all the links right there at the top where you can subscribe directly to this show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Google Play Music, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, or on whatever app you use to catch your podcasts. And you'll see there are also links to Twitter and Instagram, so you can follow us there, and I hope you do. And if you really want to connect with me and get in on the discussion with other listeners to this show, you can join our private Facebook group. You can find that at whatwasthatlike.com/Facebook. And of course, you can always email me directly at scott@whatwasthatlike.com, or just go to the website and click on Contact. I'd love to hear what you think of this episode or a previous episode. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you on the next show where we'll once again ask the question, what was that like?